I've been getting a lot of DMs from photographers lately who are interested in adding video to their arsenal, but don't really know where to begin. And while photo and video are really intrinsically linked, and there's a lot of correlation between the photo world and the video world, transitioning to shooting video from just shooting stills is definitely a steep learning curve, and that's what I want to talk about today. So today's video is all about the basics of videography, basically everything you're going to need to know to go from feeling and thinking that you want to shoot video to actually getting your camera, pressing record, and being able to do so with confidence for yourself or for your business. Now, this is not like a deep dive into editing workflows, shooting styles, cinematography tips, all that kind of stuff. If you're interested in that, I'd be more than happy to make some more videos about that kind of stuff. Let me know in the comments. But today is basically just about the essentials, and specifically 5 essential things that you're going to need to know as a videography beginner. So the first essential thing you're going to need to know when you're kind of adding video to your arsenal as a photographer is what resolution to shoot your video in. Short story, I would recommend shooting in 1080 video, but let's talk about resolution for a minute. So on a stills camera, resolution is really defined and kind of figured out by multiplying the 2 perpendicular edges of the camera sensor. So if you have the long end of the camera sensor is say 6,000 pixels, the short end of the sensor is 4,000 pixels, you multiply those together and you get 24 million pixels or 24 megapixels. With video, it's a little bit more complicated. You've probably heard of 1080 high definition video, and 1080 video is actually 1,920 pixels on the long end by 1,080 or 1080 on the short end. And honestly, 1080 video is really the industry standard right now, although things are definitely shifting towards higher resolution content. But if you look at like YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, TikToks, even though it's rotated vertical, the actual videos that they're showing, they actually scale those videos down to 1920 by 1080 vertical. 1080 is honestly a really good kind of compromise between good image quality, but not taking a ton of space on your camera's memory card or on your computer. Once you start shooting 4K or 6K or 8K, the file sizes just become insane. And so if you're starting in video, I would absolutely recommend starting with 1080 video. And then once you start needing more resolution, then you can upgrade and start shooting in 4K if your camera allows it, or 6K or 8K or whatever we're at. And if you're interested in like all of these resolutions and kind of how they all play out, I'm gonna put a link in the description to a blog from Adobe that does a really good job kind of just walking through all those different resolutions, how they all play out, kind of how they all came about and all that. So if you're interested in that, go check that out. But for now, 1080 is a great resolution to start with. So once you've established what resolution you're going to shoot your video in, the next thing you have to ask yourself is what frame rate am I going to shoot my video in? So unlike stills where you typically are shooting one image or one frame at a time, video you're trying to capture motion. And so your camera is actually capturing a bunch of images every second and playing those back in a very quick sequence, which your brain interprets as movement. Now, real quick disclaimer, frame rate does not equal shutter speed. We'll talk about that in a minute. Frame rate is literally just how many images per second is your camera actually capturing, and then the shutter is the actual mechanism through which your camera sees that. So there's a bunch of different frame rates you're gonna see pretty typically. You're gonna see 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second, maybe even as high as 240 frames per second. And your question is gonna be, well, number one, what's the difference between these, and what should I actually shoot in? All of this actually comes down to motion blur. So quick exercise for you. If you hold your hand out in front of your face and you wave your hand back and forth really quickly, your mind sees your fingers as blurry. You're not seeing crisp movement with all your fingers back and forth as you go. Your mind is interpreting that motion as blur. That's what you're trying to capture on video. Think about it in the realm of stills photography. If you're trying to capture, say like an athlete who's moving very quickly and you want to have them very, very crisp in the frame, you're going to crank your shutter speed up on your camera to make sure you stop that motion and you don't have any blur in the image. On the other side of things, if you're trying to capture a cool kind of drag shutter effect on the beach with a couple who's running, you might slow your shutter speed down and actually introduce blur into the image to create this kind of fun movement effect. The human eye actually sees movement oftentimes as a blur if the movement is quick enough. And so what you want to do with your video is you want to shoot at a frame rate that allows motion blur, and that's what those different frame rates do. So for the purposes of this video, 24 frames per second, or you might see it on your camera as 23.976 or 23.98, but 24 frames per second is kind of the standard for showcasing normal real life motion blur. So if you're just trying to capture a normal movement, 24 frames per second is the frame rate that you should be shooting in. 30 frames per second, Basically, you're never gonna shoot in this. This is kind of what broadcast and TV use for whatever reason. There's a bunch of information that goes into that. 30 frames per second, not really gonna deal with it. 60 frames per second is what you might see captured for like action sports and that kind of thing. If you're trying to capture some real life movement, then also be able to slow that down and have some slow motion footage, 60 frames per second is great for that. And then 120 above that, 240, all that kind of stuff. That's gonna be for ultra slow motion footage that you're intending to shoot specifically to slow down later in post and have that nice buttery smooth slow motion effect. Now, if you're interested in kind of exploring more into this, I'm gonna drop a blog link below in the description that talks all about frame rates and kind of what those are and how those work and all that. So feel free to check that out if you want. But for all intents and purposes, 24 frames per second is your go-to for capturing normal motion. 60 frames per second is for like a little bit of slow motion, and you can kind of get away with that with normal motion if you want to as well. And then 120 frames per second and higher, all that slow motion, you're not gonna play that back at real time at all. All right, so now we've established what resolution we're gonna be shooting at and the frame rate that the camera is gonna be capturing the data at. Now we have to talk about the third essential thing to think about, and that's how you actually correctly expose video and the exposure settings you're gonna use for video. So conveniently, as a videographer, aperture basically stays the same for photo and for video. If you open it, you're gonna have a shallower depth of field, capture less things in focus, blow out the background a little bit more, let in some more light. If you close that down, more things are gonna be in focus, less light's coming in the camera. That works exactly the same from photo and from video. Although I will say, pro tip, with video, because you're capturing so much movement, it is helpful to kind of close that aperture down a little bit more. I oftentimes will shoot at f4, f5.6, f8, because you actually want a little bit more things to be in focus typically in the shot. With video, because people are moving in and out quite a bit, it's helpful to have the aperture closed down a little bit more. Like for instance, currently I'm shooting this video on f5.6, and it just helps if I kind of move back and forth in the frame a little bit, things aren't going out of focus. So aperture is that first piece of the exposure triangle and works essentially the same between photo and video. Next, let's talk about ISO. For the purposes of this video, let's just say ISO works the same across photo and video. Now, if you start shooting log and you start working with cinema cameras, there's some times where you might not actually be able to adjust your ISO. We're not gonna talk about all that for now. For all intents and purposes, as a beginner, ISO, you can crank that up if you wanna have more light, you can drop it down if you wanna have less. It's gonna work the same on a video camera as it does on a stills camera. Shutter speed, however, is where things get very, very different between photo and video. On a photo camera, when you're shooting stills, you can kind of do anything you want with your shutter speed. With video, you actually have a defined shutter speed that you have to use depending on the frame rate that you've chosen for your video. And the formula for shutter speed is very, very simple. Your shutter speed needs to be double whatever your chosen frame rate is. So say you're shooting in 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/48th, or your camera won't shoot that, so 1/50th. If you're shooting in 60 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/20th. If you're shooting 120 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/240th, or your camera won't shoot that, so 1/250th. In any situation that you're in, whatever the frame rate you've chosen for your video, your shutter speed needs to be double that. The reason for that is a little bit complicated. Again, I'm gonna drop a couple blogs below so you can kind of dive into a little bit more of why that is, but effectively it goes back to the beginning of cinema cameras and how shutter mechanisms actually work in the cameras, and effectively how our minds kind of started interpreting the normal motion blur that happens in video. And the best way to replicate that motion blur is to double your shutter speed of whatever your frame rate is. So obviously your question then becomes, so what happens if I go outside and it's super bright out and my ISO's all the way down at 100 and my shutter speed is at like 1/50th? Do I have to just crank my aperture up and have zero like depth of field separation between foreground and background? No, you don't. That's where something really cool called a neutral density filter comes in. So this is a neutral density filter, and effectively what a neutral density filter is sunglasses for your camera lens. Now this is a variable neutral density filter, which means I can actually rotate it, and you'll see it starts getting darker and darker and darker the more I rotate it. This will limit the amount of light coming into your camera so that you can open your aperture back up and have that cool, bokeh depth of field effect in your video, just like you would with stills. So neutral density filters, or variable neutral density filters like this one here, are super, super helpful for allowing you to kind of keep your aperture wide and open if you want to have that nice depth of field effect while still keeping your shutter speed at double whatever your frame rate is. If you're interested in checking out this specific one, this is the Peter McKinnon variable ND from Polar Pro. It's honestly one of the best on the market, and I'm going to link that down in the description, so feel free to check that out. It's a fantastic neutral density filter if you're in the market for one of those. So the fourth essential thing to think about with video is actually how you have to color video. With a stills camera, you're oftentimes going to be shooting in RAW, which means you have a lot of flexibility when it comes to editing in post. You can darken and brighten the image, you have a lot of detail retained in the shadows and the highlights. You can really do whatever you want with your white balance. You don't really have to nail the exact colors and get everything perfect in camera. You have the flexibility to change that later in post. With video, it's very different. With video, you're effectively shooting, just think of it as like JPEG video. Video that you still have a little bit of flexibility to do some stuff with in post, but a lot less flexibility than you would with a raw image like you're used to editing in Lightroom or whatever your editing software is. And so because video is a lot more like shooting JPEG, you really have to dial in your color, your white balance, all that kind of stuff in camera. A couple things that'll really help with that are picture profiles and just making sure your custom white balance is set. So let's start with picture profiles or picture styles. On Canon, this is in the shooting menu, menu number 3. You can just go down to picture style, and there's all these different picture styles that change the kind of color makeup of the image depending on what the scene looks like. You can customize all these to your liking or just kind of choose one that fits the best, but those are a great way to kind of get you started in the right direction in terms of contrast and color, saturation, sharpness, all those kind of things. And then the second thing to think about is making sure that you dial your white balance in specifically. If you have a camera that shoots really, really good auto white balance, then maybe you'd be able to kind of rely on that. But again, you're not going to be able to do a lot of work with your white balance in post. And so shooting in Kelvin white balance is really, really helpful with video because you can dial in exactly the colors that you want your video to look like, get everything looking as close to perfect as you can in camera, so that when you get things into your editing software, then you don't really have to do a lot to it, which you can't really do a lot to it because there's just not a lot of leeway to edit video. Now, a couple things can be really, really helpful in terms of shooting video and giving yourself more flexibility in post is to shoot in neutral picture profiles. So if you go back to those picture profiles, there's one of those called neutral. And so if you set that picture profile to neutral, you're going to see a lot of contrast, a lot of saturation, a lot of depth kind of pulled out of the video that you're seeing on your screen. But what that's actually doing is allowing for more detail to be retained in the highlights, in the shadows, and you're going to have more flexibility in post when you edit. If you want to take it a step further, you could shoot in what's called a log profile. A log profile is even more flat, even more kind of contrastless and boring, but you have a ton of flexibility in post. If you're interested in kind of checking out what log video actually is and how to edit it, I have a whole video about that. I'll link that in the description as well. But for your purposes as a beginner videographer, I would recommend getting things right in camera, dialing in your white balance using Kelvin white balance and some picture profiles to kind of really get things as close to perfect as you can. Then once you get it into your editing software, you'll only have to make a few tweaks, change a couple little things, and you're good to go. And speaking of editing, the fifth and the final essential thing to know as a beginner videographer is how to actually edit and post-process your footage. The first thing you're going to need is an editing software. If you are part of the Adobe family and you already have an Adobe subscription, Adobe Premiere Pro is a great place to start. That might be something you already have for free. If you don't have that and you're looking for another free software, DAVINCI Resolve has a free version that you can totally download. Check that out. It's a fantastic software and you can always upgrade to the paid version later. If you're on Mac and you specifically want something that's optimized for your Mac, Final Cut Pro is also a great software optimized for your Mac. It's going to be super, super fast. And honestly, all three of these are fantastic. Premiere Pro, Final Cut, or DaVinci Resolve, all of those are great options for editing software. So two more things to think about when you're editing. First off is the actual frame rate of your project. You're going to want to always make sure that the frame rate of your actual project is at 24 frames per second. That means no matter what footage you put in, even if you put in footage that's at 60 frames per second or 120, your actual playback is going to be at 24, which means you have the ability to stretch, say, a 60 frame per second clip. You can stretch that out and make that clip play at 40% speed, which then will slow that footage down. You'll have some nice slow motion video that you're able to capture with 60. So make sure your project is set to 24 frames per second. And then the final thing to mention is actually video presets, which are called LUTs. Color correcting video can be a whole nightmare in and of itself. Because video is oftentimes not raw, there's a lot of steps that you have to go through. It's a lot more complicated than just kind of dragging some sliders on Lightroom. There's a lot more that goes into color grading video, and that's where video presets come in that are called LUTs. Adding a LUT to your footage is a great way to add some kind of color cohesion to your entire project, make all the colors feel like they fit together, and add some cool creative flair depending on the LUT that you choose. Now, if you're interested in checking out some specific LUTs, I have an affiliate link to gamut.io in the description. Gamut makes some fantastic creative LUTs for people who are looking to achieve all these different kinds of looks with your video. So check out those LUTs. Those could be a great addition to your editing arsenal and make your color correction just a little bit easier. So hopefully that's been a helpful look at kind of the basics of videography. Obviously, this is not a deep dive into color grading and sound design and storyboarding and all that kind of stuff. If you're interested in that, feel free to leave a specific question in the comments, or I have an entire playlist where I dive into all those things specifically right over here. So I'll link to that. Check that out. Thanks so much. I will see you in the next video. Peace.